Hi, I'm so happy to be joining you today and be back at the Data Fest, one of my favorite platforms, without any bias. I'll be sharing my screen in a moment. So again, I'm Eto. I work for the Digital Forensic Research Lab. It's one of the centers at the Atlantic Council. And our mission is to identify, expose, and explain this information using open source research. Basically, open source is everything that one can find in Google and that is accessible. And our team has been focusing on Russian disinformation and information space around Ukraine a lot. Currently, Russia's war in Ukraine is our main focus. And prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, my colleague and I published a research indicating that Russia was highly likely to invade Ukraine. Basically, our examination of the Kremlin online outlets that are highly accessible to everybody led us to that conclusion. And we observed that the Russian online outlets were preparing some ground for Russia's next moves by claiming that Ukraine is planning to attack its eastern region or Russia. And the escalation of narratives was in line with the Kremlin's next moves to further invade Ukraine. Basically, the data from the Kremlin outlets were predicting the Kremlin's next moves, which escalated in the invasion. And we found out that between November 2021 and January 2022, the coverage in Russian media of the Ukrainian attack preparation, in brackets, rose dramatically, with a nearly 50% increase in January. And I'll be explaining in a few moments how we did that and what was the methodology of our research, etc. As you remember, there was approximately 4 months period prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, when the alarming discussion around Russia amassing troops near Ukraine started. On November 1, 2021, Politico published a new commercial satellite photos that you can see on the screen, confirming that time period reports that Russia was once again amassing troops and military equipment on the border with Ukraine after a major buildup of spring 2021. And these satellite imageries, which were taken by Maxar's Technologies, one of the most famous satellite imagery platforms, these images were shared with Politico, and the images showed a massive buildup of armored units, tanks, self-propelled artillery, along with the ground troops massing near Russian city of Yelnya. And there were lots of discussions around the topic. And the main question was, will Russia further invade Ukraine or not? And as you remember, some officials and analysts were saying that Russia is bluffing and they won't dare do that, and there won't be any further invasion, while others were warning and ringing the alarm bells that Russia is going to invade for sure. And meanwhile, the Kremlin-owned and pro-Kremlin online outlets increasingly reported over the 4 months period leading up to Russia's recognition of independence of Ukrainian two regions and then invasion, that Ukraine is planning some kind of attack. And while monitoring in this period the Russian information space, we observed that this narrative, like this kind of narrative, the blaming Ukrainians of planning attack, was increasing, was gradually increasing. And we decided to measure how this narrative proliferated on Russian media. And for sampling, because we could not have checked all the Kremlin and pro-Kremlin media, we decided to take 10 Russian outlets that you can see on the screen, and to examine, and these outlets have the long history of spreading Kremlin narratives, disinformation and propaganda. And we decided to examine these 10 outlets and to see in time how and which narratives they were sharing, and how, if it was changing or not, how the number was changing. Then we decided to select 6 Russian keywords in Russian language to track the coverage of the narratives. And when these keywords were Ukraine, the abbreviation of Armed Forces of Ukraine, the VSU. Another keyword was provocation, attack, and offense, all of them in Russian. Basically, we wanted to use these words to find, to search for the narratives, right? And when applicable, we use the root of the Russian word, as you can see in the second column, because it's like this is like the common letters prior to the ending, because in Russian language, Russian language has 6 noun cases that alter the suffixes, right? So we took the roots just to be sure that we are not missing anything. And we applied the combination of these words to identify the articles that were publishing those claims that Ukraine was gonna prepare to attack. And the combinations were made out of these words. And at the end, we utilized 8 combinations consisting of these 6 keywords. And the time period of the queries that we ran was the beginning of November 2021 through the January 2022, basically the end of the January 22. And then the invasion happened on February 24. And to collect the data, we used SERP API, a real-time API, which is application programming interference with access to Google search engine results page, basically to scrape data from these 10 outlets. And the query, that the result that we had was that in that period, these 10 Kremlin outlets published 2,888 articles, which contained those keywords, the combinations of those keywords that we chose. But there was one thing to do, that we had to exclude the false positives. Basically, the articles that used these keywords but were not spreading the narrative. For example, I don't know, the statements from Ukraine. The official Ukraine is denying that they are planning an attack. This would be the false positive narrative. So to exclude this kind of false positives, we decided to go through all of these articles. Basically, the results from the SERP API query showed the articles' titles. Here is how the results looked like. So they showed the articles' titles, the lead of the article, and the opening paragraphs. So in some instances, when we started to go through the articles, this information that you can see on the screen right now was sufficient in assessing whether the article was spreading a narrative or not, because we could see the big part of the article. But in other instances, we basically in other instances when the data was not enough, we went to the article and we read them. Basically, we had to read quite a few articles to check if they were spreading the narratives or not. We reviewed them manually. So then, after removing the false positives, we found that 317 articles were sharing this narrative that Ukraine was preparing an attack. And the outlet with the greatest numbers of the articles pushing this narrative was RIA.ru, one of the most prominent Kremlin online outlet. And then it was followed by Tsarograd.tv, East.ru, and Vesti.ru. And there are there were several things that we should consider while doing this kind of research, that there are always some limitations when you're taking some samples. And in our case, we had the following limitations. That, for example, we took the words attack and provocation, right? But other synonyms of these attacks could have been used by these outlets to spread the narratives, right? There are so many synonyms for these words. Then the second limitation was that it was kind of the self-selection bias in choosing only 10 online outlets, while other outlets might have been pushing for the same narrative as well, right? Hundreds of them. Then another limitation was that the time period was limited to only the past 3 months, like prior to invasion. And maybe for the more full picture, it would have been better to have like couple of months period to observe in a long-term period. And then last but not least, another limitation was that results relied on using a real-time streaming API, which only collected mentions from Google search results. So the next move was the narrative proliferation in examining the narrative. And the identified articles, like those 317, they cover the narrative that Ukraine is planning a provocation or attack on its eastern region or Russia. And these kind of claims were presented in the following forms. It was either the coverage of Russian authority statements or the coverage of authority statement in the Russian occupied regions of Donbass, or the interviews with Russia's so-called political and military commentators, which are in the most cases spreading the Kremlin narratives. And we observed, interestingly, there was we observed in narratives a big difference in the time period. For example, the narratives differed in the content. If some narratives were accusing NATO and the West, particularly the United States, of being behind the provocations, others were claiming that Ukraine was the one who was preparing attack. So there were many self-excluding narratives, basically. Another thing that we observed, and it was very interesting, that the narrative in the 3 months period became very hostile. If, for example, in November 2021, the narratives claimed that Kiev was violating the ceasefire agreement and there was a possibility that Ukraine could attack Donbass, in December 2021, the outlets blamed that the United States were already training the extremists for the purpose of attacking Donbass. And in January 2022, the outlets were claiming that Ukraine might stage a chemical attack, like the specific attack in Donbass, and blame it on the so-called leaders of the Donbass. And this is the most important slide of our presentation. So out of the 317 articles spreading these narratives, 151 articles were published in January 2022. It means that there was more than around 50% increase in spread of the narrative that Ukraine is going to attack prior to Russia's invasion. And it means that the Kremlin was preparing the pretext and the context to justify its further invasion. And it was also preparing the domestic and international audience that Ukraine would do that. You can see this dramatic increase here. And then to get a better sense of how the news outlets were reporting the various versions of the narrative, we added the headlines and the texts of those 317 identified articles to a word tree. I would really recommend you, if you would like to see the word tree. But basically, a word tree puts the keywords into the context by identifying the most commonly used words following the specific keyword. And one of the greatest tools, it's open source, it's free, is here you can see jasondavis.com. Basically, you can copy paste the text that you are working on, and you have this kind of word of tree showing which words were used, and then the most, and then the least used keywords, etc. Basically, you have all the context of the many of the separate information. And in our case, the keyword attack, in Russian napadenie, like here, was connected to the words on Russia, on Donbas, on Crimea, and by Ukraine on. So basically it means that all these outlets were mentioning that attack would be by Ukraine, on Russia, on Donbas, on Crimea. And this was another good illustration how this narrative was spreading. This example showcases like one Russian translation of one word attack. However, other terms, so for example, including attack or offensive in English, or the provocation, were also used in the similar context. You can see that, for example, provocations here is followed by the word chemical weapons from Ukraine, from United States in Donbas. Basically, you just put the text there and you have the whole context of what the articles are talking about. And of course, the scale of this online operation is much bigger because, as I mentioned, there are, I don't know, hundreds, if not thousands, online outlets that could have been spreading this kind of narratives, and the prediction would have been better. But basically, the tactics of the Russian online outlets was in line with the steps planned by the Kremlin, and the dramatic increase in numbers and the narrative that became more and more hostile closer to the Russian invasion led on February 24 to Russian invasion. One of the interesting things, basically, I wanted to cover related to this research are false flag operations and allegations. This is a very interesting tactics used by the Kremlin in the current war. So what is a false flag operation? Basically, false flag, as you can see on the screen, it's a hostile or harmful action, such as an attack, that is designed to look like it was prepared by someone else other than the person or group who is responsible for it. Basically, a false flag is a political or military action carried out with the intention of blaming an opponent. For example, you do something and you blame it on another person, but before you prepare a pretext for it and basically say that, that person is going to do that, and then you do that. So the whole 3 or 4 months period that I was talking about prior to invasion was full of false flag allegations, that the blaming Ukraine of having plans to attack Donbas or to attack Russia. And monitoring and detecting false flag allegations are important, especially during wartime, as they can predict the next steps of the actors. And in this came the next steps of Russia. Just wanted to show you 2 brief examples of the false flag operations prior and after Russia's invasion. One of the examples happened on February 18, when it's a couple of days prior to invasion. On this day, if you remember, there were 2 different videos spread by the so-called leaders of Russian-occupied Luhansk and Donetsk regions. They announced the total evacuation of the regions, and they said they made their address, the video address, and they stated that they were evacuating civilians into Russia. After making unsupported claims that Ukrainian saboteurs managed by official Kiev, had attempted to detonate chlorine tanks. And they were mentioning like sabotage a lot, basically in their video statement, basically saying that Ukraine is planning sabotage in Donbass. And these claims were followed by a car bombing in Donetsk, which local authorities quickly claimed that it was an assassination attempt against their so-called government official. Basically, on that day, they said that Ukraine was preparing the sabotage, and then a couple of hours after, the car was bombed. And they said that, see, we were warning you, Ukraine was going to do that. Another interesting false flag operation happened on a interesting and, of course, the horrible one happened on March 21. On this day, Ukraine's State Emergency Service reported that the Sumy Khimprom chemical plant, it's a name of the chemical plant in Sumy, and Ukraine reported that there was a shelling by Russian forces of this plant, of this chemical plant, and as a result of the shelling, one tank with ammonia was damaged, and there was an ammonia leak. And interestingly, 2 days earlier, the Russian Colonel General Mikhail Mizintsev, he made a statement, and he specifically referenced to the Sumy Khimprom chemical plant, and he named this plant, and he stated that Ukrainian Nazis would engage in a false flag operation, and he said that Russia had information that Ukrainians mined storage facilities containing ammonia in order to massively poison inhabitants of Sumy, and then blame it on Russians. So this statement was made on March 19, and then on March 21, Russia shelled the same chemical plant, and then of course blamed the Ukraine. So this kind of false flag allegations we have been observing, I don't know, on a daily basis, hundreds of them. Of course, not all of them are implemented, and it's hard to claim which might be, which might happen in reality and which not. But again, these open source data spread via statements, spread via official websites, and not only via Telegram channels, they still give us a picture of what might be happening next, of what might be coming next. And this is one of the things that we are working right now, collecting the false flag claims and kind of making warnings in our research, etc. And of course, we will be continuing to do that. And I would really recommend, I mean, if you are into this topic, if you're monitoring the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, the most well-documented war in the history of humanity, this is one of the interesting things and techniques I would recommend you to do.